Hi, welcome everyone to ECPG Live. In the spirit of Veterans Day, this episode is about active military veterans and gambling. We have some amazing guests, many of whom have served in the military or work with veterans currently. But before I bring them on board, I'm Tana Russell. I'm the Assistant Director at the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling. As always, we have Rob Maya behind the scenes helping us out with today's episode. And you can interact with our guests through the chat. This is being streamed simultaneously to both Facebook and YouTube. So Rob is viewing all the comments that come in from both places, and you may see some of your comments appear on the screen for our guests to talk about and address or answer questions you may have. So please feel free to interact with us. We love that. And as always, we ask that all comments are compassionate, kind, and respectful. With that, we're going to bring in our guests. You'll see Dr. Ty Lostutter, Dr. Ina Bott, Glenn Osowski, and Jeff Wasserman joining us. So I'm going to let them give you a little more of an introduction, and we'll just start at the top of the screen here. So Dr. Lostutter, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Ty Lostutter. I am the current president of the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling. And in my copious spare time, I'm also an associate professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Center for the Study of Health and Risk Behaviors, where we study risk behaviors such as disordered gambling, as well as substance use and mental health.
And Dr. Ina Bott, welcome.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Ina. I always jokingly say I coined Dr. Ina when I found that Dr. Phil and Dr. Laura could do it. I said, why not me? So that's where you have it. I'm currently, I'm a clinical psychologist, inspirational coach, and I'm sort of an independent contractor currently. I served in the military for 30 years, 4 different branches: Air Force, Army, Navy, Air National Guard. And I've been in the addictions arena for about 40 years. And so married, 2 sons, and live in the Puyallup, Washington area.
Thank you. And Glenn Osowski, welcome.
Thank you, Tanya. My name is Glenn Osowski. I'm a ICGC2 gambling counselor, Marine, former Marine, 13 years in the Marine Corps, also in recovery from gambling. I've worked throughout the VA in numerous positions and spent 5 years at the Cleveland VA Inpatient Treatment Center as a readjustment counseling gambler for the inpatient gambling treatment program. Currently at the Ann Arbor, Michigan VA, working as a vocational rehabilitation specialist and adjustment counselor there.
Excellent. Thank you again for being here. And Jeff Wasserman.
Hi, Tana. Thanks for having me. I'm Jeff Wasserman. I am the Judicial Outreach and Development Director at the Delaware Council on Gambling Problems. I also serve on the Board of Directors of the National Council on Problem Gambling. In my spare time, I co-host a podcast with Brian Hatch. Hey, Brian. Called All In, the Addicted Gamblers podcast. And I also run a support group on Zoom for problem gamblers with participants from all over the world, and have 3 wonderful grandchildren. Thanks. I'm also in recovery, by the way, from gambling addiction, which is important. 5 years without a bet.
Excellent. Thank you. And I saw Brian is tuning in. Like Jeff said, he and Jeff were on a podcast with us. So definitely check that out. They did a great job. So we're going to jump right into some discussion topics for you. And like I said, please feel free to jump in on the comments or ask questions, and anything that we don't have time to address while live, we may put in an ECPG extra blog post following this episode. because sometimes there's so many comments that come in, we can't address them all. And so we might just address them in the blog afterwards so that everything can be talked about. So our first discussion topic is simply to let's talk about what is the state of gambling in the military right now. What is it that we're looking at? Glenn, would you like to start us off on that topic to get this rolling?
Sure. Basically, for active duty military that are stationed overseas, there are a plethora of gaming like casinos on base that provide gambling opportunities that are identified as recreational activities. And, I think Ty will get into more of the baseline of who is having issues in the gambling, but basically the military is almost 50% or 2 times more likely to have a gambling disorder than the civilian population. And then you add the suicide risk with veterans in general, which is 7 to 10 times that of civilians, along with those with a gambling addiction. You have a very serious issue in the military. And I guess the hardest part in the military with gambling is that military ideals of asking for help and not being able to ask for help, because usually it's a very punitive message in the disciplinary roles that in the military. So it's a very kind of, how do you assess, how do you determine, how do you help active duty military personnel with a potential gambling disorder, and how do you assess for it?
If I might jump in, Glenn's completely right. I actually think about gambling as a developmental issue in some ways. And if you start with people who are, right, because we're dealing with populations from both active duty into veterans, right? So people who become active duty will eventually become veterans. And so if you think about it in some ways, trajectory wise, a lot of active duty military start very early, like 18, like, right, you can join the service of the military at age 18. So there might be exposure in that early part of your military career, which may not be a problem, may or may not be for some individuals, right? So they start exploring military, and if you're in on base or something like that, you might use gambling as some sort of way to alleviate boredom or create social activities amongst people that you're joining. And then over time, those problems may develop worse. And so you actually, then you have as Glenn was just pointing out, that it might be difficult to actually get services or even ask for help while you're actively in duty, because there's some ramifications that you might be in some ways penalized for asking for help. And then there are those who finally move from active duty to veteran services. So there's more likely that we will actually see perhaps more veterans meeting criteria and actually getting help, but it might have been a problem that might have existed for a long period of time. And what we also see is it tends to be developmentally kind of heavy episodic, right? So people could have problems, they start to self-correct, they have problems again throughout their life. And so we'll see this kind of ebb and flow of different kinds of problems. And some people, problems become so serious, they actually get issues that happen while they're in military service that might actually get them disqualified or discharged from the military. And then there are others who, when the time they get treatment in the VA or any kind of veteran programs that they might get treatment on, it might be in several years now that they've had these problems going on and on and on. And so in some ways they're dug in a lot of ways. And we know that for military populations, they tend to be the current studies that we've been done, which are not always great, but the studies that we have had on research on this topic have typically found that the rates tend to be twice as high as the civilian population. So we know that this population might be more at risk, which is why I'm really grateful that we're having this discussion today during during the week of Veterans Day tomorrow. So.
And you're muted, Dr. Ainabad, if you want to unmute yourself and jump right in there.
I think it's unfortunate that oftentimes mental health is the last stop before the veteran is discharged. And so oftentimes they're reluctant to seek help because of their types of jobs. Oftentimes, if they have clearances, all of that comes into jeopardy. And then once they show up to mental health and treatment, behavioral health, they have to realize that their commander is actually our client. And so it just sort of opens the door, because we have to report back to the commander what's going on with their particular soldier or airman. So yeah, we have a lot of roadblocks, unfortunately.
Just to point out, like, so the Government Accountability Office did a study, and they looked at the number of, like, in the Department of Defense, the people who sought treatment while on active duty over a 4-year period was only 486 military active duty military in the branches, which only represents like 0.03% of the entire population at the time. So really small people actually sought services or were identified as problems while they were active duty. So there are real barriers to try to overcome for the active duty military populations.
And also too, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ty, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that, I come to learn about veterans and military gambling really by accident. I'm not a veteran. I was a lawyer for 30 years before gambling addiction caused me to change careers. And now I work a lot in the criminal justice system in my state. And in an effort to try to advocate for the fair treatment of offenders in the criminal justice system whose offenses were motivated by a gambling problem or gambling addiction, I was directed by people with a lot more power and a higher pay grade than myself to go into Veterans Treatment Court. And that's when I had to educate myself and learn about veterans with gambling problems. And it was fascinating to me, and of course sad in a way, because I was always used to the stigma that gambling addiction has in the general population and even in the field of mental health. But when you add that to somebody that's been in the military and the whole idea of, I can take care of my own problems and the military culture, which I understand, that makes it even more of a challenge.
And I think one thing I'd like to add too is that some of the basic tenets that make a good military service member are often found as very, very big traits in a gambler himself or herself. And so that competitiveness, that ego to be pleased, all of these things feed this addiction like no other. And again, it's that inability. And I have spent some time now over the last couple of years going to DOD installations and educating the mental health personnel that are servicing our military, and they're even unaware of the issue. And I think really that is our biggest challenge in this arena, is really understanding and educating the mental health professionals on how to provide treatment and actions that are create the ability for the person to really ask for help. And that, unfortunately, what we're seeing now and what we have continued to see over my 25 years is that it's handled in a disciplinary way. Oftentimes that military person will lose their benefits. So even if they are discharged with a dishonorable discharge because of acts directly related to their gambling, they may not even be eligible for VA services. So this whole cycle continues without help. And by the time we saw people at the Cleveland VA, every person had exhausted everyone in their life and everything in their life because no one really understood what they were going through. And it's really one of the biggest challenges that the National Council and others have, is really educating. So legislation, I've always said I fought in all these different countries and did a lot of stuff for my country, and I loved that. And people ask me all the time, so how do you feel about legalized gambling? And I always say, well, I defended this country and the democracy and that it's all about. And so if a state decides that they want to have gambling, I'm not against that. But what I am strongly for is for these states to provide treatment for those that have the problem. And that's where we see a real disconnect today.
And I think that's especially apparent when you think about the revenue that the Department of Defense makes as a result of slot machines and overseas bases. $100 million a year, and zero of those funds go towards either treatment, prevention, education. And that's the real shame. And I agree, Glenn. I think most of us feel that gambling should be legal and most people can gamble without a problem. Where we part ways, especially in the military community, is that there is this critical need for treatment and education and funding, and that just seems to be tragically absent.
I also kind of compare it. I like to talk about, how long it took the country to realize cigarettes were bad for you and that process of turning that. We've seen it in the military, maybe a little bit with alcohol, that there is some sort of understanding or a little bit of acceptance that we can treat people that may have an alcohol problem or a DUI problem or a disciplinary problem with alcohol, but that's really where it stops. And there's just really, for drugs and for gambling, it's really, well, if you have a problem and you're not disciplined enough to stop it, then you're not right for the military.
So we'll start bringing in some comments. But first, Dr. Bott, did you have something you were going to throw in there?
Yeah, I was going to comment with what Jeff and Glenn said, because as a provider, clinician, he's right as far as us having pretty much nil exposure to someone with a gambling problem unless they're on their way out the door. I wasn't even aware of all the different slot machines and things until I got stationed in Korea. And it's like, wow, it was an eye opener. And just like Jeff said, once they come to your attention, it does promote a sadness because their career is in jeopardy, their family is on the losing end, and it could result in, most times, if it's bad enough, punitive bad conduct discharges, all kinds of ramifications that if we had been more in tune of the problem, it is now in DSM-5, thank goodness. But prior to that, unless someone really had a significant problem that affected them, I was thinking of a situation when I was in Korea. We had someone that, in Korea, you have to pay for your rent 12 months in advance. And one of our soldiers, he got $18,000 to pay for his rent for 12 months. And little probably did the command know that he had a gambling problem until it surfaced when he went to the casino thinking that he was going to double that 18,000 and lost it. And then being asked, as an officer, being asked to leave. But then he went back the next day and won it all back. So that adrenaline is going and you get this false sense of confidence. So you go back thinking, okay, it's like a vicious cycle, just like has been alluded to. So I'm so happy to hear what's being done now to make us more as providers aware of the soldiers and their calamity, what they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned family. Rob, let's pull in a comment. If you see a comment from our company, that's either Rob behind the scenes or Maureen, who's tuning in and watching and participating. She asks, are active duty veterans and military family members also at risk for online gambling and gaming issues? So we know that the service members are their family as well at risk for developing gambling problems?
I think so, especially overseas, because most times it's a small base and you're sort of isolated. And since now you really don't have to go downtown and gamble, it's right there on your base. And so you just go to the clubs, and from 18 on, the young people, they can go and there's the slots, So I would say yes.
Yeah.
there's some data that actually bore that out as well. So I will say that there have been some studies that show that, again, and we don't really know if it's genetic or behavioral.
Yeah.
And I don't think it really matters in my opinion, but it really is clear that problem gambling can run in families. And we know that one of the biggest predictors is if you have a family member who's had a problem with gambling, that you are at higher risk. Doesn't mean that you're going to develop them. For some people, that actually, by identifying that risk, they're actually able to protect themselves, do more things to put in things in place. So it's not in some ways like destined to be, should it happen, but it is a predictor that you should pay attention to. But I think that's hard because, again, a lot of families don't talk about these issues, and therefore sometimes people aren't aware of them unless they're aware of them kind of off the periphery. And so it is a thing to be aware of. The other thing that we don't really have a very good handle on at this point is online gaming and its relationship with gambling, right? So we know that a lot of new technology and a lot of games, like just actual video games themselves, have embedded in them kind of recreational activities that are related to gambling. So there's these components where you see these two worlds merging, where you see gaming and gambling becoming more and more connected to each other. So there's an area ripe for research about these connections as well.
You know, I just wanted to add something, especially with regard to family members, because it's so important in the civilian world that we recognize the immense harm that family members experience as a result of the problem gambling or addicted gambling from their loved one. And clearly the same would be true for military family members. I also think that loneliness and boredom that are risk factors in the civilian population, I mean, that's only magnified if you have a loved one that is overseas. A family member misses that person, and what do? Sometimes, but they seek to be with other people at the casino. They seek to rid themselves of the sorrow and pain of just being bored and lonely by gambling. And sometimes, as we know, that develops into a problem.
Right. And I see some comments coming in right on point with our next topic. And you just did such a great transition into this, which are those risks for the problems. What is it that puts individuals who have served at risk for problem gambling or having gambling related problems of any level?
I think the first part I will talk a little bit about is just the culture of the military that kind of leads to this gambling sort of thing, much like drinking in the military was. That was a camaraderie type of activity. Gambling is, you know, we were told many times on deployment, hurry up or wait, or when you were deployed on a ship off the coast in the Middle East. What we did for 60 days is we sat there and waited and did nothing. And gambling became a very easy way to pass the time and to be competitive and to get those juices continuing to go. And it was always very attractive to do that with your peers. So, like I said earlier, I think some of the risks that make a good military man or woman can also be some of the traits that we find with people with a gambling disorder.
Glenn, could I ask you a question as somebody that obviously served in the military? If alcohol use is discouraged, can the same be said about gambling? I mean, it seems to me that just like in the civilian world, the radar isn't often on when it comes to developing a gambling addiction. You know, we know about alcohol, we know about substances. When I say we, the general population. But recent studies show that half of the general population think that problem or compulsive gambling is a personal or moral failing. So I wonder in the military if it's almost like we would rather you gamble on the slot machines and on our base than go into town, get drunk, and end up having a bar fight. And, you know, has that been something that you've either experienced or heard about?
Well, I think it's really just the availability. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy, right? Is that you have these clubs that serve alcohol that's kind of one of the daily activities, because there are so few things to do, is to go to the club, have a couple of beers, and then go into the slot machine room or whatever. So that becomes a culture. I think what the issue is, and it's not just in the military, but it's in the civilian world too, is that we even have experts, right, who disagree with that gambling DSM-5 finally getting put in there, that there are people who still in the mental health profession that may disagree with where gambling disorder even goes. And when one doesn't have the kind of personal experience with a problem gambler, or with a soldier, or an airman, or a Marine, or a soldier that is actually educating them and saying, oh, geez, I could not imagine this was even there. It's really unknown. And so what people do in the military when something's unknown is they'll look at the person and say that is a character flaw. It's a character flaw that is just going to transcend into his or her military service. It's a judgment. It's the scarlet A that's put on that gambler, and they will never lose it, which just creates that more and more need to soothe all these issues when your career is going down the drain. Because it affects so few people. Most people can gamble normally, right? That's the whole point of this. And to wrap our heads around that and to educate people on that is the struggle that we have. And we have it in the legislature, we have it with the National Council, and we see all of these statistics, and Ty can speak better about them to me than I can, but I will tell you, we have seen a marked increase of legalized gambling across the United States, and proportionally, we're seeing huge problems. The problem is, a gambler's problem is not going to, if a casino opened up in Cleveland, Ohio, when it opened up, for the first 2 years, you're not going to see issues created by those casinos being open, but you're starting to see them now. You're starting to see all of these problems being put out there. And until we get a handle on how we can do preventative things, how we can do prevention and education in this, and going back to who could be, that's the one thing the military has started to do, is we look at pre-deployments, right? So when I was in the Marine Corps and we were going to go on an 8-month combat deployment, we trained as a unit for 1 year in the United States in various places. And what the Marine Corps is doing now is they're actually doing testing and teaching mindfulness during this process, to be aware of what's going on, and to actually allow the strength of being able to say, hey, I might have a problem here, and identifying it in that way, in the part of the piece of financial counseling. We're always trying to find this piece. Where can we get in? You know, I always want to check that military members' finances before they deploy, to make sure that they are sound and they can do their job when they're called and asked. And we found this kind of way, well, why don't we ask some of these assessment questions during the financial review of a soldier's history prior to deployment, to understand, even, you know, as a gambler, my relationship with money was much different than anyone else's, right? And what is that about? And when you start educating people about how money seems, it didn't mean anything to me. As long as I had money, it was like my oxygen. I needed that. And looking at ways there that you can manage this without being intrusive and being judgmental. And I think sometimes it takes that kind of effort to look at how and where you're going to ask for these assessments, because there's no urinalysis test for my gambling problem, right? And how do you really, I'm not going to certainly volunteer that information. So how can we go about it and ask those questions differently to identify people that are at risk before it is a problem?
Right. And I think for individuals like us that are already familiar with the problems gambling can cause, when looking at a group of individuals being exposed to things like combat trauma and having accessible casinos and slot machines on base, it makes perfect sense that a fair percentage will have some gambling related problems because of that. But I think, like you said, and like Dr. Ina said, there's a lot of people that don't have any idea that this is a problem or aren't putting those pieces together. So all the more important for us to be talking about it.
And I think, yeah, the one thing I was going to say, I see the question probably from Maureen going to Jeffrey, which is a struggle all the time, is the creating of special courts, the veterans courts and other special court dockets. Judge Cheryl Moss out in Vegas has created a gambling court that's really kind of the creme de la creme of what this can be, because the real issue oftentimes brought up by people that have struggled with gambling is, how do you make restitution? Well, I know one thing, I can't make restitution when I'm incarcerated. And taking responsibility for my actions in a supervised place and employment is probably the most important place where I can do that, and I can learn how to be a socially functioning person who's paying his bills and paying his debt to society while he's working and paying off his bills. I think the ideas of these special courts is the key piece, and we're a long ways away from that in the military, and thankfully in the civilian sector they're expanding the special court system, but the evidence is overwhelming. The success rate of the motivation of someone to enter one of those programs, avoid incarceration and pay their debts, and actually live a life in recovery instead of just punishment. Because sending someone to jail like I was for 2.5 years, that didn't help me at all. Gambling in jails and in prison is the currency, is how you survive in jail. So you have to actually understand then that you're putting someone who has a problem right in the throes of the issue. And if we're really caring about how we're incarcerating people and how we're handling rehabilitation, we have to look outside the models of the past.
I'd be happy to answer that question that's posed about therapeutic justice, diversion, and how few there are with regard to gambling. Which, as Glenn points out, there is only one active one, which is Judge Moss's court in Nevada. I'm actually wearing the shirt that Judge Moss gave me for her court. She's amazing, and I wish there were more of them. When you think about it, there are over 3,000 drug courts. And, the question was, how can we expand veterans and drug courts across the country? Well, since we're obviously talking about veterans issues, I will tell you that one of the positive things that I found is that, when we talk about veterans issues, we get a lot more attention and a lot more willingness to listen and collaborate than, frankly, if we talk about gambling issues. So I found that not only is it important to educate our judges and our lawyers, prosecutors, our defense attorneys about the high rate of problem gambling among those in active duty and veterans, but we can actually use that opportunity to educate the general public by focusing on gambling addiction within the context of veterans or active duty military issues. We at the Delaware Council have a conference every year in March to commemorate National Problem Gambling Awareness Month. And a couple of years ago, we focused on active duty veterans and gambling addiction. And we had a huge turnout. We had presenters that were willing to present. And I would suggest, because it involved issues with veterans and military personnel, that otherwise there may not have been such a willingness to present. So, once we educate about the issue, then I think it becomes much more of an avenue to get the changes that we want to get. We in Delaware now screen every justice-involved veteran for gambling addiction. We all know about the higher rate of gambling addiction for people with co-occurring disorders, substance addictions, and of course the same is true in Veterans Court. So now we're able to do that in Veterans Court. it would be wonderful to expand it, as the question suggests, to other areas, because we want to attack the underlying problem that caused the criminal behavior and not just punish, have someone come out and repeat the same type of offense in the absence of actually, getting treatment.
Absolutely. Let's bring in this comment on co-occurring disorders. It says co-occurring disorders with substance use may be obvious. Can you talk about impacts of PTSD, TBI, other trauma issues, and gambling as a release, self-medication, escape, etc.? Dr. Ina, do you want to take a stab at this one first?
Yeah, of course. But prior to that, I wanted to sort of comment on Jeff and Glenn's comment about how much money comes in with the gaming, the gambling, the casinos, et cetera, on the bases. Every time we get assigned to a different base, we have what we call in-processing. So during that in-processing time, we go through a lot of different classes, whether it's on race or drug and alcohol abuse. And I think starting with at the basics, just sort of introducing to a soldier that this may be an issue, because in their culture with arcade machines and video games and whatever, it's just become a natural for them that they may not even realize, hey, maybe I have a problem, maybe I'm spending too much time doing this and that. And as you may not be aware, but it took a long time to deglamorize alcohol in the military, because that was a social thing. Every Friday it was a way to bring out the introvert. Okay, we have a sort of like a keg or whatever, and they would just gather around that keg on Friday night or Friday after work, and it was just something fun and natural to do. And so, but we no longer do that because of the deglamorization that came about. And I think if we just introduce, because a lot of the monies go into morale, welfare, recreational kinds of activities, and they look at what's going on in society, arcade games, gaming, video games. So they end up putting a lot of that money, investing a lot of that money into those types of things, not even realizing that they may be triggering some of those addictions. So with the trauma, the PTSD, those are ways that you can escape. Those are ways that you don't have to think about, I'm depressed, I'm lonely. It's a form of self-medication, if you will.
I would, yeah, and before Dr. Ina or Ty kind of chime in on the TBIs and the exposures from combat, I think, the one thing that I think that can really help explain everyone how addictive gambling really is and how seductive it really is if I am suffering from PTSD and I can't go grocery shopping, I can't go to a crowd or to a football game, I don't like any of that because I don't feel safe. Yet somehow I can go into a casino with all the noise, with all the bells, with all the people, and sit there and gamble comfortably. And none of my PTSD issues are showing up. That's because I'm actively engaged in gambling. And my brain is hijacked and I have nothing, no symptoms. And so I think it's really important, because people will look at that and say, how can you not go grocery shopping? You go at 11 o'clock at night before the store closed because you don't want to deal with people, or you're doing all these things. You can go into a casino, stay there for 18, 24, 36, 40 hours straight, and hear noises, bells, whistles, not be exposed to all of those people on top of you and not have a problem. So I think sometimes that's kind of a hard one to say, well, what's going on here? What's really going on? Is there really a problem? And, over 60% of the people that have been deployed in the last 15 years have come back with some sort of TBI. either a concussion, symptoms, and all of these things. And Ty and Dr. Ina can talk much better about what that does in our decision making as gamblers. But I think I just wanted to identify how seductive and how nice gambling is because, you know what, people with significant PTSD for years, that is their only relief. It was my only relief. I couldn't find any other sort of activity, healthy, unhealthy, that gave me what it was like to feel normal again, except if I was gambling.
All right, we're going to bring in Judy's comment here. Hi, Judy Burns McCormick. Thank you for tuning in. She says traumatic brain injury is another risk factor that those in the military are especially prone to from explosions as well as combat. How are they to seek help if they cannot see the problem and the military punishes them for a gambling problem resulting from their military experience? That's the golden question, right?
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's yeah. Go ahead, Ty. It's not really the golden question. It is the elephant in the room, and how are we going to address this? And all the legislative things that we have asked the military to do, the defense acts, they're not doing. And so you're right. It's an obvious thing to those of us that are specialized in this field, and to the neurologists, they can explain this. But making that transition to making it a policy to look at this is something that I'll let Ty talk about.
Well, I only know about one study that's looked specifically at TBI, and it was a study that was done on a more convenient sample, but the rates they found were somewhere around 60% of individuals who had TBI also had higher rates of problem gambling. So we know that these two things exist. TBI is a really complex issue because really TBI is a large umbrella term that's used for people, as we said, could be mild concussion to severely brain damaged. And depending on which parts of your brain got hurt can have different effects. So we see various things. We do know that the prefrontal cortex, this front part, is actually part of really important in decision making. And so it is the part that is normally disrupted by a TBI of almost any kind, as we normally see at least some prefrontal, which affects your decision making, which, as gamblers know, decision making, stop, go, bet more are very important things that you need to make an informed decision that can be, of course, hampered. And so TBI itself tends to be very complex, and there's lots of ways we can get very, very finite. But I will say that overall, we see this relationship. And I do think that there is right. We're normally needing, I think that the overall thing that I think that lots of us have commented on is there are lots of different places that both active military and veterans, because when they interact with either because they're told in the military what to do, there are lots of places that we could probably do interventions or prevention interventions that might actually help prevent some of the problems that we're seeing. And we also know that there are ways that we can kind of make our healthcare system provide at least brief screenings and interventions that we could do when people are interacting with different aspects. And so what we're hoping is that by suggesting that there are multiple points where people can get information and services, that they will get, first of all, identified as having some problems, and then hopefully pushed into something that will actually help them provide the interventions that they need. I do actually, as someone who studies like cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness, I can explain like the PTSD symptoms that go away, because as Glenn was quite politely saying, is like sometimes that's the most soothing thing to someone who actively is avoiding all other things in their life because they're paying attention to all of these cues in the world that are making them very, very hypervigilant and very, very nervous and feeling so much anxiety. And that somehow gambling can be we would call it like kind of negative reinforcement, in that it takes the bad stuff away and lets you kind of just sit out there and zone or dissociate. And so those kind of video games things have appeals to people who have experienced a lot of trauma. And in some ways, those environments can be, you can find a machine or a position that lets you kind of keep the room at bay. So you're constantly varying like how risky is it to be in this casino environment. And you're right. So some people are like, how are people able to go to a casino and gamble and still have PTSD symptoms? both can be true. And the way that we know is that some of those activities actually are soothing in some ways. They allow people to escape, or at least put their attention on something that they're so hyper-focused on that they're not paying attention to the other thoughts. And really, I think this brings up to a very, as someone who's trained in mindfulness, this meditation practice that we teach people, it is very clear that where you put your attention is what basically brings up the connection between thoughts and feelings. And so if you're able to find, I think in some ways the intervention, I'm even in my head thinking of like, if we could teach and healthy things to keep people entertained while they're on active military bases and deployed, and how to do things while they're in local military bases, or actually in environments like things like mindfulness or other activities that could be both exciting and fun but promote good health, that would be different. But I think that the inherent part of all gambling is there's games. And in some ways, human beings like games. We are creatures that are socially connected, and having these kind of aspects are what brings lots of people lots of joy. And the other piece I think that I would like to just chime in about is what we are saying is we don't want to eliminate gambling per se. We get that most of the population doesn't have a problem. What I think we're all in agreement is that there's a large amount of revenue being created from gambling, and that some of that money could be funneled back into services. I will say in all other countries outside of the United States, almost all other countries do this very broad-based public health view that they actually put money towards resources to their populations. I will say also, it is hard to do in the United States because in some ways, all of gambling is controlled normally at a private industry level, right? Like industry and companies run them, where in other countries, they are run by basically the governments that do this. But the military is the one place that is government focused, right? It is part of the military. And therefore, everyone who's watching and anyone can talking, your government, believe it or not, we've just had this discussion, your government should represent you. And so if you feel like problem gambling is an issue that the military should pay attention to, you should be able to tell your congressman, you should be able to tell people who are serving you in politics to care about these issues and actually write laws and implement regulations so that the Department of Defense, the Department of VA Services could actually make these things so that people get better services than what they're getting now. That is the one area where I think we could easily get something going as a broad country. And the military is, as all of us know, and we care about the people who actually serve in our military. They're our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, our daughters. These are people that we love and care about. And if what we need to do is try to provide them the best service possible, I think that's where we start, is trying to get these things changed so that people actually take care of the people who've taken care of us, who's protected us.
And if I could just add one quick comment to that, I like Judy Burns' McCormick's kind of line of thinking, but there's one piece that in the military is very different, and Dr. Ina could probably speak to it even better than I can, but there is immense pressure. Now, if I'm a combat battalion lieutenant colonel in charge of a combat unit, and I need bodies, I need people on the front lines working, and it is a long practice of the military commanding officer to lean on his psychiatrist or on his mental health staff and say, hey, you need to clear this guy with his TBI or his mental health potential issue because I need him out there now. This is combat, it's life or death. And as crazy as that sounds, the big conflict in the military often is, what is our mission? And a real dilemma for a mental health provider or a medical provider in the military is to stand up to the commanding officer and say, no, this person is not ready to go. The culture of the military isn't for us to stand up and say, you know what, this person is not ready to go back to where he was at. And the last thought I want to share is, the other kind of connection between the military and problem gambling, it's important to look at cigarette smoking as well. The ties of cigarette smoking and gamblers is the evidence is overwhelming that there's something going on there. And smoking in the military still is a pretty high item. So it's always, and that's another place where in an assessment, if you have a cigarette smoker who admits to being smoking, it's worth asking one or two other kinds of questions like that. That's just another example of that military culture and where that stuff happens, that it's so different and unique that oftentimes people can't understand how could someone possibly send someone who is not ready medically, physically, or mentally back to the battlefield? But it's a real issue.
If I can just add something really quickly, because I know we're running late, but I don't want to forget to focus also on our veterans. I mean, we've talked a lot about active duty, especially with our veterans. There are opportunities, in my view, at the local level to advocate for treatment that our veterans need because they've developed gambling issues while on active duty. You know, we go to our local VA hospital and we give talks and trainings to social workers, to behavioral health professionals about gambling addiction. And that's really where you can actually see the work being accomplished. You know, when we talk about, the federal government, it's almost overwhelming when we try to see the fruits of our labor. But on the local level, there are many opportunities. There are so many local veterans organizations and agencies that you can be involved in, getting it, just doing a tabletop and passing out information about problem gambling. It's amazing the kind of reception you get, because invariably people come over and will say, yeah, I did have a problem with when I was in Korea with slot machines, or when I came back from active duty, I wanted to replicate the kind of risk taking and excitement that I experienced while in combat. So what did I do? I went to gamble. And that gave me that same kind of, experience. So those kinds of issues for veterans, I think it's really important to focus on in the local level.
And even apart from the VA hospitals, because I worked with the VA, I was part of the team that brought the HCMI, homeless chronically mental ill program into the domiciliaries. But even when I go to the vet center, I look on their wall, they have lots of brochures on every topic imaginable, but there's nothing on gambling. So if we could just sort of generalize whatever it is that we're doing at the VA, that it needs to be at the vet center as well. And one of the things there was a question about what are we doing to help our soldiers with the TBI. I think primarily you have to heighten the awareness of the provider, because they don't know the type of questions to ask. And sometimes it's self-threatening, if you will. It's like having your own therapy when you're in therapy with a client you're evaluating, and if something touches a button, oh well, I go to the slot machines, or I do this, or I do that. So you're going to minimize, or you're going to skirt it all together and just move past it, and then say, oh okay, well, he's just depressed, or she's just depressed, or she's just feeling anxious, or whatever it happens to be. So I think the awareness has to, just like we spent lots of money on deglamorizing alcohol and even smoking. I mean, we went from, in the 70s, you could smoke at your desk, to now you have to be 25 feet away from whatever building you work in to smoke. So I think if we do those kinds of things, and it starts basic, as soon as the soldier or the person comes to the vet center or whatever, introduce those types of things. Okay, have a checklist. Okay, well, are you experiencing helplessness? Are you feeling despondent? What's going on with you? How's your family? And then getting to those key aspects of, well, maybe there is a significant problem here. Let's explore more. Let's get the family involved, and let's treat the whole system.
We are coming up on the hour. Is there anything else you guys would like to add on this, as far as things that could be done, things people could take away from this, any low-hanging fruits or words of encouragement you can leave us with on here? On this
I would
topic?
like to, I'm sorry, Glenn, you want to go ahead? Okay, I'd like to say just two things that I'm involved in that may be of interest. Firstly, as was mentioned, we do a podcast, but also there's an offshoot of that podcast called Fall In, the Addicted Gamblers podcast, and it's targeted to active duty and veterans with gambling problems. We just started it recently. We have several episodes. One of the guest speakers that we had on an episode was Dr. Chapman, who runs the veteran treatment problem gambling center in Cleveland. It's just a wealth of information. So that's one way to just to learn about it. The other thing is, now in the world of Zoom, everybody is having Zoom meetings and obviously webinars and presentations, support groups on Zoom. It would be wonderful to have a veterans support group for problem gamblers. You get that connection with other veterans just as a result of the culture. You also get a connection as a result of being in recovery from this addiction. So the two connections, I think, would make a really great opportunity for people to get together and share their experiences and recover together. So I just wanted to add those two things in.
Thank you much. And I will just leave you with a reminder that we have a blog post on this episode. You're seeing it slide across the bottom of your screen. It has many, many links and resources. Almost everything our guests have referred to during this session is already on there. We may have some more things to add as well. So great place to look up resources on how to do things. And also the podcast that Jeff was just talking about, we put a link in the chat for you there as well. And it's also linked to the blog. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Oh, and Maureen's giving a shout out. This is really great. We need to mention this. Next week, we're having a live online training. One major track of this training is on serving active military and veterans. So if you want to get more information on this, there's 3 days worth of information we're bringing to you next week on this. And so you can visit our website for more information to see what's coming up, view presenters and topics. And there's other tracks as well on gaming and on ethics and on clinical supervision. So it's packed full. So check that out so you can see what's available. There are scholarships available to treatment providers, recovery and peer coaches, students, and educators. So check that out, and we will see everyone next time. Happy Veterans Day.